Create in me a clean heart and purify me. Create in me a clean heart so I...
Welcome back, everybody, to the Racial Unity Leadership Summit virtually here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're so thankful that you joined us and that you are hanging in there with us. We hope that you had an opportunity to get good lunch, but also an opportunity to reflect over the incredible information that we had an opportunity to engage with this morning. If you weren't here, then you need to go back to the Facebook feed and to the video and see what you missed. But truly, Bobby Green, Dr. Anita Burton, and Don McLaughlin really set the tone for unpacking some things. As we go into our time this afternoon, we have an opportunity to hear from actually three panel discussions that are going to be led talking about specific books and specific concepts that are going to drive us deeper into understanding what is happening in this schism in terms of the races in our country. Where does it come from? What is the history about that? And what do we need to do as Christians to begin to address and bring unity back to not only this country, but back to our communities, back to this nation, and ultimately to the world, so that it can start to reflect what God wants in his creation. Our next session for this afternoon, kicking off the afternoon, is going to be led by Joshua Jackson. And the title is The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. I've known Brother Josh Jackson for a really long time, and he didn't send me a bio. And so that's typically a mistake when you know somebody a long time and they don't send you a bio, because there's so many things that you can say about them. But I will say that Josh Jackson is from Wichita, Kansas. He has a bachelor's degree from Abilene Christian University and an MDiv from Emory Chandler School of Theology. And I keep trying to tell Josh he needs to start his PhD, but he keeps dragging his feet. So hopefully one day he'll come along and do that work as well. But he's currently the senior minister at the Rural Hill Church of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee. So without any further ado, I will toss it over to my good brother, Josh Jackson.
Thank you, Byron. Like I said, I trust you. I trust you wholeheartedly. It's one of my best and most dearest friends. So thank you for that introduction. So our panel today, we're going to actually be looking at the book that Byron told you, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race by Dr. Willie James Jennings. And what I want us to do in these times, we're going to kind of formulate this text in a way where our three panelists will actually take a section of this. But even more so, what I want you to do is to think about imagination and theological imagination. And before we get started, I want to read a quote from this book and kind of frame this text as how Dr. Jenkins, or what the point of this book is and what he's looking to do in his text. He asked this poignant question. He says, what happened to the original trajectory of intimacy? And he defines intimacy as this community among all believers that God is seeking to create. He says, in this book, I want to answer that question by telling the story of modern Christianity's diseased social imagination. I want you to hear what he just said. He says, Christianity's diseased social imagination. What he walks through in this text is a construct of our theology, not so much of the systems in itself, but the actual theology that those systems produce and how they're intertwined. And so to give us our first part, where we're going to be talking about intimacy, and we're going to be talking about how these things all connect, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, our first panelist, Osharye Hagood. And Osharye is a certified life coach, health and marriage coach. She also serves as the spiritual director for Product of Grace Ministries. She leads alongside her exceptionally intelligent and wonderful and amazing husband, Rudy Hagood, at the University Christian Church in Los Angeles, California. She is the mother of 7 amazing children, the mother-in-law to 2 super incredible women, and 2 amazingly loving men. And she is a grandmother of 8 and a heart of melting grandkids. Now, one of the things that Osharye didn't say in that she is just super talented and gifted and does so much for the Carl Spain Center. And honestly, this conference right here and the graphics and a lot of things that you've seen were done by her. And so we appreciate all her hard work behind the scenes and making this possible. So with this, I will turn it over to Ms. Hagood.
So I'll unmute myself, and thank you so much, Josh, for the introduction. And I love the work that the Carl Spain Center does through Jerry Taylor. I want to start with sharing my screen. Hold on one second here. Uh-oh. Okay. I just have to find the screen that I'm trying to share. I think it's here. So in my practice as a life coach and a spiritual director, I work to guide people on a journey back to themselves, that they may, from that space, understand their creator and thus call out to him for understanding, purpose, and direction. All the work that I do leaps from Luke 10:27 and the Deuteronomy 6:5 passage, which is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and all of your strength. So my mission is to help people turn around and to re-engage the depth of themselves. I not only teach them the importance of going back in the direction of God to repent, but I teach them the practices that help them to commune with God, the practices that brings them into the space of conversion and repentance. I'd like to show you a video that will be helpful in summarizing my section regarding the topic of displacement. I cannot.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is create this circle here, and we're talking about humans' relationship to land. And what Jennings is arguing is that the Western European Christianity is built upon an Aristotelian idea of perfection being up in the place that we're trying to get to. And it evolved into this idea of race, where the whiteness was perfection and blackness was lostness, essentially. And so the whole human endeavor, was to become more white, more perfect, more Christian. And this is what dominated the imagination of the West and Christianity, which led to colonialism. And this is to be in contrast to the indigenes, the native people of the land, who saw themselves in interconnectedness with the land and this idea of place. So what happened during colonialism is that this Western idea of self and autonomy and individualism came and displaced the indigenes. And then they had this idea that you could take the land and separate it into little squares, and that each individual self could own property. And this is a total idea of displacement. And this is what Jennings says is captured in the story of Acosta.
So as I listened from a life coach perspective, I listened to the mind of the brilliant Willie James Jennings. I naturally experienced myself traveling back through time and meeting with my ancestors on the way. I naturally felt the shame and confusion, the helplessness and fear, My soul cried out, my God, why have you forsaken us? Yes, I went there. And it was easy because that trauma lives in my cell. For cellular trauma transfers generations. And because I still live on the land of what many call perfection, because I was snatched from my place of origin, trauma still transfers. Can you imagine the trauma that transfers down from a boy slave who at the time was considered the tithe? When they brought over 235 slaves, they tithed 2 boys to the church. That trauma transfers. Zurara, a Christian intellectual who was charged with keeping the theological account of European colonialism, spoke of those who were in chains and being shoved and walked off of the slave ship. I saw myself in the crowd. He told of us. We kept our heads low and our faces bathed in tears. Some of us stood groaning, crying out to heaven, fixing our eyes upon it, and as if asking for the help from the Father of nature. These are Zurara's statements. For to him, it was not the true God. I saw myself there and I wept. For who was he to know who we were crying out to? Who was he to know who we were crying out to? He didn't know our language, and thus he could not understand who our God was. Who was he to separate the creator of God from the father of nature? For is it not the father of nature that created nature? For was it not the God of creation that created nature? Did he not create the night and the day on day 1, and heavens on day 2, and on day 3, the dry land, the sea, and sprouting of the vegetation? Did he not create the 2 great lights, the sea and air creatures on day 5? Beast, livestock, creepy things, and man on day 6. Nature was created before man. Is he not the same God who created the continents and the people thereof, those that were created to work and to keep the land, according to Genesis 2:15? Yes, he is the same God. Yet the leaders of a people group reconfigured God's vision and declared themselves the knowers and perfecters of all things. The leaders of this people group made a conscious decision and deliberate actions to take perfection and to create a new world, a new landscape, and even new names and descriptions of people. They made themselves the standard, placing themselves in the new position as God. But I am afraid that this distortion, this reconfiguration of the vision of God not only causes the displacement of Africans and indigenous people by those who considered themselves perfect, but these actions places this people group in what for me is terrifying. 2 Thessalonians 2:4 says, but he has taken his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. But who is this arrogant people? Who's arrogant enough to take the seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God? I'm afraid it might be those who took the life and killed the indigenous people. Those who demanded the assimilation to the perfect race. Those that drove out and dominated God's creation with weaponry. I'm afraid it might be the ones who enslaved God's creation. Could it be the supersessionists, those who overrode the Old Testament and making themselves the chosen people of God? The reconfiguration of the vision of God. Could it be the ones who believe the lie themselves? You know the lie, that it's supreme, that it has done well with the world, that displacement and slavery was good for them, and now they know God. My friends, the European Christian reconfiguration of God's vision is tainted, it's skewed, and it must stop demanding conformity to it. The result of this false vision of God is displacement, disconnection, and disregard, not only of God's people, but also of his land. Why do you think that God mentions land when he says that if my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray, seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I would heal their land. The land is extremely important to life. The European system disconnects himself from the life-giving resource of creation, from the people and the land. And the structure continues to convince people of this vision and thus leads people away from the life-healing resource found in God and in his creation. In the replacement of himself as Lord, he teaches others to continue in the direction away from God, away from themselves, and to the idol worship of comfort and greed. For Jennings borrows from what he considers a marvelous phrase from Calvin Luther Martin's The Way of the Human Being. What if your skin was inextricably bound to the skin of the world? What if it seems strange, odd, and even impossible for you to conceive your identity apart from a specific order of space, a specific land, specific animals, trees, mountains, waters, and arrangements of night and day? For example, if you snatch me from my place of origin, who am I? How will I know who I am? How will you know who I am? How will the land now live and thrive without me? For I was created to keep it. Shall it not also mourn for me, its keeper? For Romans 8:20 says, and highlights that the creation groans because of our sin, our disconnection. For sin is disconnection. And now we live in a land here in America that mourns for its keepers, those who were murdered and displaced. Now, as a life coach and a spiritual director, I ask you to do the same as I have done. Turn around. Where are you in this story? Are you a part of the system that places itself in the seat of God? Or are you the lost wandering, longing to return to purpose, to life, to God? Where have you placed yourself? Do you see yourself? And if you don't, keep looking. Because we are all a part of this tangled web. And the only way back is to turn around, to go back in the direction. The only way back is to repent, to replace, to repair. I'm trying to stop sharing my screen, but I can't.
Mm, thank you. Thank you so much. Honestly, so you guys obviously can post in the chat, but there's also at the bottom of your screen, it says reactions. And just from what you've heard, if there's anything you want to say to our Sister Hagood in that wonderful presentation, oh, so moving and so informative. Thank you. Thank you. I want to connect a couple dots before I turn this over to our next presenter. Jennings this is a very deep book. It's a very academic book, but it's very engaging and very thought-provoking. But one of the things that Jennings doesn't do is he doesn't pull any punches. He seriously jumps off the deep end. And so if you are going to wrestle through this book, you have to be prepared for that, because he doesn't go easy. He doesn't take it lightly. He recognizes there's a major disconnect from our fundamental understanding of what it means to be the people in God and what it looks like and how we portray that in our systems, in our environment, and how we treat one another. And so thank you to our sister Osharye for setting such a wonderful overview of that first section. So now we're going to turn and I'm going to introduce our next presenter, a dear friend of mine by the name of Josh Ross. So Josh is the lead minister of the Sycamore View Church in Memphis. He is married to Casey and they have 2 boys, Truett and Noah. He is the author of 3 books. He loves playing and watching sports. He loves vacationing with his wife. And he also enjoys eating authentic Mexican food. Amen. He is a recovering Texan. We'll pray about that later, who is learning to thrive in Memphis, Tennessee, with the church committed to restore justice, opportunity, and dignity in Memphis and beyond. And so with that, I'll turn it over to my dear friend, Josh.
Hey, thanks a lot, Josh. It's an honor to be a part. Just been such a rich day for me and all of us. This morning was just mind-blowing. I'm so thankful for the work that Dr. Burton and Don, and I need a little more Bobby Green in my life. I don't know about you. That was just fantastic. Real quick, I feel the need, especially with so many people on here, because there's a deep love for Jerry Taylor. Jerry grew up not too far from where I am right now in Millington, Tennessee, the same place Justin Timberlake grew up, but Jerry was the original JT. And I would just want people to know, if you didn't already know, that Jerry in 1978, a decade after Dr. King was assassinated here in the city, Jerry was voted to be the class president of a large high school, predominantly white, which tells you something about the character that God placed in Jerry at a very young age, that people saw something in him. So to be a part of something, just a movement that Jerry is one of the primary leaders, is a great honor in my life. Let me just jump in and start with this. Words matter. God used words in Genesis 1 to create the world. God spoke, things happen. Words destroy, words create tension. And how we use words, how we interpret them, it matters. So one exercise I've tried to lead our leadership through, especially over the last few months, in some ways over the last few years, has been, what do we mean when we say things like racism or Black Lives Matter or white privilege? Like, what is our definition? Like, how do we even think about some of these words and phrases? Because it matters. One thing I love about Jennings' book, and Josh, you said it so well just a moment ago, very intellectual, academic, but so thought-provoking. And in the intro, he said he grew up with a family who knew the Bible, but more importantly, they knew the world through the Bible. And I thought that was so important. And here in just a little while, we're going to talk a little bit more about a phrase he made about that we have a diseased social imagination. But the one chapter I want to focus on today is about mission work. And I think some of the ways Jennings goes about telling this story, I think will be applicable for us. And it's not just mission work, it's about translation. So what happened in South Africa is something that has happened throughout the world and still happens throughout the world even today. When you have white Europeans 150 years ago who decided to go into certain places in the world, into tribes in Africa, it was as if Christianity inverted its sense of hospitality. It claimed to be the host, the owner of spaces, and demanded Native people enter into its cultural logics. So what happened is you had these people who would go into places or go among tribes, and their mindset was as if God was not present with the people at all. The narratives and experiences didn't matter. That we have what they need. Like they don't have anything we need. We have what they need. So Bishop John William Colenso was a white man sent to South Africa to the Zulus. He was driven to be a translator of the Bible. And the purpose of scripture for him was to teach us our duty, not to enable us to sit in judgment on the souls of our fellow creatures. And as you read so much about this bishop, he had good intentions. He had a pretty healthy theology. He wanted people to know the Bible. He had a breathtaking view of the loving Father God. He wanted people to be saved. But the problem was he was with people going into a place to do mission work in which he was caught up in a world of white superiority. And where there is white superiority in the mindset of people who are going in, there also has to be Black inferiority. Because for me to think a lot of my people, I have to think less of the other person. So theological statements for us, even today, it deepens one's understanding of the moral structure of human existence. Now, for them, unfortunately, the morality or the immorality of every African that they were trying to serve was determined by how much that African would support white interests and European cultures. So there was a group of people who conquered the land. A superiority mindset was in place. And with a desire to take over the land and to be superior and control, there was a desire to, we also want to give the Bible to people. And when you give the Bible to people with a superiority mindset, disruption is going to happen. With the Bible was a desire to move African society forward to European methods. It was a colonialist system. A desire unapologetically was to gain full control of the African. There was no respect for the African's way of life. It was a mindset of let's give them a Bible in their language, yet there was a hidden agenda or just an overt agenda to control Black flesh. It was thought that Southern Africa lacked religion because they were deficient, like people could not think on their own. So what you had were you actually had African converts who found themselves caught between two worlds. So it was a world of white controls the land and whites, like your citizenship is based on how the whites allow you to be part of society. But then there was also suspicion from other Africans. Colenso, a Bible translator, first translated the book of Matthew for the people, and then the New Testament, and the work he was probably most famous for was the book of Romans. But without a cultural understanding and without humility, we become people who police theology. And this has been so dangerous for years that we police theology. We want to help other people grow closer to God, but we want to police how they think about theology. The lenses they engage the Bible through, the lenses the Bible wants us to engage the world through. So it's not just what you know, it's what you do with what you know. They were determined that Africa needed them. Now, later on in Colenso's life, there was actually like just a switch in the way he thought about the world. Colenso reversed his idea that the Zulus had no religion or no knowledge of God before they were there. And he made this statement that if men are wanted merely to cram the native mind with creeds and catechisms and raise a number of human parrots, repeating dogmatic phrases and formulas, no one benefits. The act of translating is an unrelenting submission to another people's voice for the sake of speaking with them, not to them, not for them, but with them. It is precisely this submission that is denied in the overarching colonialist process of translation. In translation, we can't afford to turn from the natives or to turn from the other. We can't afford to project upon the other what it is we think their narrative needs to be. And this is where for years God has really formed my life and my theology a lot with Romans 11, when the message of Paul there is that Jews and Gentiles are grafted into this ongoing story of God. And where God really started challenging me about a decade ago is today, no one gets to be the Jew in the story of Romans 11. Yet too many people want to be the Jew. We want people to be grafted into our narrative. So what you have a lot of times are white people in white churches in the Western world who are all for reconciliation as long as the other person is reconciled into the white narrative. And this doesn't further the kingdom of God. It's not what God wants. It's not what Romans 11 wants. So on the one hand, what you had were created, westernized Christian Africans who exhibited a westernized false consciousness. And on the other side are Christianized Africans who carry out a different set of questions and concerns reflecting on African consciousness. And if we allow translation to disrupt the colony like this, it results in cultural nationalism, which we see in a lot of places throughout the world. So translation is necessary to Christian theology, but it's also dangerous. And in the end, the settlers got what they wanted. The settlers got pretty much everything. And Colonso, once he made this switch in his life, he lost everything. And the story of his life is that translation is vital. Translation, language, vocabulary, they matter. Now, real quick, let me just share a story from my own life about this. When both of John died a couple of years ago when he was murdered, we had a unity event. We had a worship service here, and there are 4 churches here in Memphis who have been together for some racial unity events over the past 5 to 6 years. And Northeast Side Church, where the preacher is Jimmy Stokes, has become a good friend of mine. He's become one of my greatest teachers. And it was time for Sycamore View, which is still predominantly an all-white church, to host this event. So we had the space, and we were going to host this event. So it was a Saturday morning, and many of you throughout the nation may have been a part of certain events. It was a Saturday morning in which everyone was calling it a racial justice event. Yet at Sycamore View, what we did, without even thinking about it, is we couched it as a racial unity event because justice sounded too strong. I guess justice sounded too strong. And Jimmy Stokes was kind enough to call me as a friend and to say, Josh, throughout the nation, churches and people are gathering, and we're not calling it as a unity event. This is a cry for justice. And it really pushed me to think that a lot of white folks are all for unity. We just want to kind of skip over the chasm and skip over the mess and get to a more unified world, when what a lot of our Black friends and people of color are teaching us is a lot of times you can't get the unity if you're not willing to stand for and wrestle with justice. So just translation, vocabulary, how we use words, they matter. I'm out of time, but thanks for letting me share.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you. Thank you for aiding us and continuing this dialogue, continuing this conversation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tiffany Dahlman. Tiffany is the lead minister at Courtyard Church of Christ in Fayetteville, North Carolina. She is also an adjunct instructor at Church of Christ institutions and program director for the ACU Dallas Christian Service and Formation degree. She's completing her Doctor of Ministry through ACU on how wisdom Christology can inform finesse in the local church context. And I want to say this really quickly about Tiffany. Tiffany is an amazing preacher. The spirit is real in Tiffany. I've listened to many of her sermons. She's one of my favorite preachers that I like to go listen to. And Tiffany can tear the house down. She will tear your pulpit apart. So believe me, the word of God is real, and what she proclaims and her relationship with God is also real. And so it is my honor to introduce our next panelist, our sister Tiffany.
Thanks, Josh. That was kind. Thanks. So let me say this here in the beginning. We're talking a lot about origins today, about going back to the beginning. And there is a white tendency to say, oh, those aren't my sins. I'm not a part of that. So I'm going to quit listening. And this theme has come up again and again. And I want to just keep reiterating it because I think we need to hear it again and again. Because in all these conversations we've had, including this one here with Jennings, like any good therapist, we're invited to go back to the original sin so that our futures can be honest and pure. No good therapist starts to begin to heal and solve a problem with today. We always go back to the original sin. So I want to go back to the original sin highlighted in the chapter, the section that I had with Jennings' text. And then I'm going to have a little bit at the end and talking about how it informs our present, and then turn it back over to Josh for a question or two. But my section there, it's called Intimacy. And he continues this conversation about language and literacy and how language can be used to join people together, yes, but also divide. Jennings says, literacy is in service to emancipation, yes, but it is also in service to colonialism. And he gives all sorts of examples of this double-edged sword, and I can't get into hardly any of them, but I do want to highlight this one. In 1740 in South Carolina, there was a law that said that any white person who taught a slave how to read or write would be fined 100 pounds. Nearly 100 years later, in South Carolina, there's a law that's almost identical, except it's $100 now instead of 100 pounds. But there is an addition to that law that says that if any slave is caught teaching another slave how to read and write, then he or she would be lashed 39 times on a bare back. So this addition to the law tells us that there are slaves teaching each other the intricacies of the language of their oppressors. This has been going on. And Jennings points out, sort of like what Osharye was talking about with the land, that this learning of language was made a little bit easier because the slaves were there on the land of their oppressors, their feet in the soil, the climate on their faces, and they picked up the language. And this literacy was attempted to be stamped out because language is power. And we say that a lot, language is power, but what does that really mean, and what is our role in that? He gives another example about Kenyan school children, where we have French colonialism, and their mothers, their own mothers, are beating them for speaking their native language, forcing them to speak French. If they're caught speaking their native languages in school, they have to wear a sign around their neck that says, "I am a donkey." Language, it says in a quote here that he uses from the time period, this is the early 1800s. If any group of young men in the Antilles is seen to express himself well, if he has mastered the French language, this one should be inordinately feared. Keep an eye on that one. He is almost white. Language defining race, but never completely. Never completely, because no matter how well a person of color would speak the language of his or her oppressor, it never makes that person white enough. And these effects are amplified when we're talking about religious language. And this is where Jennings turns his attention, and he gives all sorts of examples about abuses of religious language. One of them I want to mention was with the Reverend Charles Colcock Jones. And he was a white religious teacher of slaves in the 1850s. And he took Luther's small catechism, kind of a bizarre thing for us in the Churches of Christ, but there's this thing called catechism. And he took the catechism, the series of questions and answers, and he twisted it. And so now some of the questions in this catechism that they spent hours going over, it read like this. Question: when Negroes become religious, how must they behave to their masters? Answer: the scriptures in many places command them to be honest, diligent, and faithful in all things, and not to give saucy answers even when they are whipped for doing well, to take it patiently and look to God for their reward. Question: who gave you a master and a mistress? Answer: God gave them to me. Who says that you must obey them? God says that I must. What book tells you these things? The Bible. Of course, written in English. So through this history that Jennings beautifully articulates for us, it is that oppressed and marginalized people are using the language of the colonialists to try to get the colonialists to hear them, to tell their stories, to get some respect, to make a way of survival in this new world that's been forced upon them. And in the beginning, the colonialists do all they can to stop it, to prevent the oppressed people from learning the new language at all, but it's unstoppable. So then, eventually, the dominant race requires the native and oppressed people to speak their language as they speak it, if they want to be deemed civilized, to make a living wage, to be considered equal. And this isn't an ancient story, for how often do we hear white people comment today of Black people, "He is so articulate, she speaks so well." And this is done in the name of good theology, because as Josh mentioned, conversion at any cost, even forced conversion, is a justified end for the means. So what Jennings invites us to do is to go back even further than colonialism, to go all the way back to Pentecost, to reimagine God's intended use of language. And I find this whole scene of how this happened at Pentecost just to be fascinating, because God took the tongues of the 12 chosen in the upper room with the disciples, physically above everybody else, and gave them the language of the masses below. Had them speak the language of the foreigners. They spoke the language of the wanderers. They spoke the language of those who had come who did not know Christ. God did not open the ears of the foreigner to understand the language of those above. Rather, it was the other way around. And Jennings calls this a gesture of communion. He says, the speaking of another's language signifies a life lived in submersion and submission to another's cultural realities. Nothing is as humbling as learning the language of another. So to close this up, this history that Jennings tells us is one where colonialists took the theology from the old world, transplanted it into the new world, and wrangled everything in that new world to fit into this eschatological new creation, according to the imagination of the colonialists. And it led to divine sanctioned oppression. It's a heresy of horrors, because new creation is bigger than the imagination of any one race, any one gender, or any one class. A purer praxis, as Jennings would imagine, would be, to say in our language, this is Tiffany's language here, taking what Jennings said, but to take the old world, the established church, and to join together with the new world in equitable cooperation with the Trinity, to observe what God is doing on that land in creation, and imagine together a new creation in mutual submission to God in the other. And this requires humility, and it requires a letting go of superiority in all things, including language. Because Jennings says that where there is superiority, there is not equity. And where there is no equity, there cannot be intimacy. Not intimacy like Jennings envisions it, this deep, intense joining of humans across race, class, and gender into one body, flesh body of Christ. For that level of intimacy to happen, there must be equity, even in language. So in the congregational context, our continuing conversation that you can go back and have, I'm going to put that hat on here, the minister hat. We are invited to consider where we have superiority of language at play. Where is language mangled up in our churches? Where is language at play where worth, personhood, or respect is tied to it? Maybe it's in the Bible translations we use, in the dialects we allow in our pulpits, the words of our prayers, the ordering of our pronouns, church words that may be a hindrance to people who are trying to meet Christ. Jennings includes a section where Isaac Watts is changing the lyrics of hymns so that England replaces Israel. Have we rewritten scripture in some way that it is no longer good news to all people? The charge here is to surrender our tongues, surrender our language like at Pentecost, to use language as God intended it, a gesture of communion, so that we are brought into this deep, deep intimacy that Jennings envisions in the body of Christ. Thank you.
Oh man, thank you so much. Before we have this, we're going to have a conversation together. I want to offer something that was really profound for me that happened probably about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer than that. When I had this realization about a particular translation of the Bible that Tiffany mentioned, how this affects things. I grew up in a congregation where there was a certain translation of the Bible that was the real text. Now, I grew up in a predominantly Black Church of Christ, and some of you know what I'm talking about. We're not going to say anything negative about a translation of the Bible. But this particular English-based Bible was rooted in the King's language, Shakespearean English. But somehow it was the text for this predominantly Black church. And we argued for it. We debated for it. It was the one. But this was also the language of the oppressor that we had been given and we had been instructed was the right one. And if you were just to somehow think that maybe there's another translation out there that's accurate, that's God inspired, no, this is the one. And I don't think we ever gave credence to what is this text actually doing to us? Who were the people who were instructed to translate this from its original language and to give it to these individuals now here in America? Shakespearean English isn't our native tongue. It's not the language of us, but it had become the language that we had to use to assimilate into this culture. And so with that, I want to ask a pointed question to our sister Osharye, because I want her to connect a couple dots. And I really want to hear her, I just want to hear her honest, raw answer to this. This, what Jennings talks about in terms of disconnection and when you displace people, how have you seen, or what do you think the impact of displacement has been in terms of how we as people who've been displaced, how we see ourselves, and also how we imagine God and the work of God?
Sure. One of the reasons why I do the work that I do is because of my father. My father raised us in the Nation of Islam. And in the Nation of Islam, he also, via that, he also taught us that the white man was the devil and that Christianity was the white man's religion. And God had been calling me for years. I mean, I remember going into the house that I grew up in, running down the hall. My very first memory was to run into a room that was ultimately mine, and it had a Bible in there. It was the only thing in the room. And I didn't understand what it was then, but it stayed in this house over the years, in spite of the fact that my father wanted nothing to do with Christianity. Because my father said that he would never serve a God who looked like his oppressor. And the problem with displacement and how a people group creates this displacement is that it cancels out the hope of millions of people, because my father represents millions of people who will never come to the Christ because they have a false image of God. Displacement disconnects us from ourselves. It disconnects us from our God. It connects us from our understanding of each other. Displacement, when you snatch a people from the land they were created to care for and to keep, like that's embedded in the DNA of that person. And when you snatch them from that and you place them somewhere else, what do they have to connect to? My father now is 93 years old, and I know that it is by the grace of God that he still lives. And it is my prayer that somehow there can be some connection, that he can turn back and actually see that, Dad, it was not what you thought it was. That the enemy, through a people group, has separated you, displaced you, and put you somewhere obviously you don't belong, but the God of healing can even make change in this place. So it distorts everything.
Thank you. Thank you. So profound. So we're going to have a short dialogue for these next couple minutes. And so Josh, Tiffany, Osharye, just feel free to answer how you will. So Jennings says modern Christianity's theology operates with the diseased social imagination. He claims something is missing. So what do you think is missing? And how has that aided in the racial divide?
think listening is missing. Hearing is missing. If we're not giving voice to people in our congregations, around our tables, and not just in a paternalistic way or a token way, but a I want to hear you way, and sharing the stories, that there can be no shared imagination.
I would say, and I think for a few hundred years, a lot of us, especially white Europeans in the Western world, have had a very truncated, narrow view of the gospel that's been primarily driven by status with God, unsaved or saved. And I've been studying revivals just on my own the last couple of months, and it really blows my mind that less than a decade before the Civil War was one of the great awakenings that happened in America, where hundreds of thousands of people surrendered their lives to the Lord or made some kind of faith decision, yet there didn't seem to be an effort by them to imagine how the gospel can transform a culture and cause us to live in relationships differently. When the Civil War started, there was a movement among soldiers in the South, over 100,000 of them, who made faith decisions, but it was primarily about status change. It wasn't a gospel that calls us to make, for personal transformation, but also a personal transformation that makes for a better world. Any imagination that's only for the individual isn't a kind of imagination that God wants us to have. Imagination is meant for me to be transformed by God, to be a part of the much bigger, larger story of how God is transforming the whole world to God's self.
So let me build off of that, because one of the things that Jennings talks about is this idea of a shared imagination. But he says that one of the things he observed in the Theological Academy was there was this fundamental resistance of theologians to think theologically about their own identity. So how do we think about an identity of God if I can't even think about how I see myself? I can't even be introspective. And he says this is problematic. And so what does it mean to think theologically about one's identity? And even for people who have been displaced or disconnected from where they are, how do you go about thinking about self when you've been given a new identity? You don't have your own. You've had to recreate one, or somebody's given you an identity. So how do we begin to think theologically about one's own identity?
Yeah, that's tough. As I was listening to Osharye, I was thinking about those Hebrew words we find in Genesis for humanity, humankind, and earth. We have Adam and Adamah. Adam, humanity, and Adamah, the earth. And it's the same word. There's this connection between humankind and the earth. And it's got to be there. And when we're taking people from their land, and when we are living in lands from which we did not come, it's so mangled, as Osharye was telling us. And yet I know the answer is in this new creation, this new land, and I don't have all those answers yet. We need group imagination to see it, but it's connected to the earth in some redeeming way.
Josh, I'd like to chime in and maybe in hopes of moving us from this intellectual perspective of God and really settling in to the reality that we are soul. Everything about our Christianity is about the saving of the soul. That's what we talk about all the time, but we are in a major disconnect with what that even means. If I just sent a question out and said, what is the soul? How do you connect with that? Most of us don't know, because what's a part of this European structure is the mind is God. Everything we think we know about God stays in this intellectual space. And so what I would say is that we first must imagine who we really are. Like, we got to disconnect from what I do. We got to disconnect from what I think. We got to disconnect from what I feel. Because who we are is different from all of those things. And so in order for us to actually put ourselves in a position to think theologically, we got to first see God in us, and stop thinking about him and stop trying to act like him, but actually be what he has created us to be. But that first takes going back, getting back in. Who am I? Sitting with God, communing with him, allowing him to tell you who you are and why he has said, yes, you, Osharye, 2020, United States of America, I will empower you to do what I want you to do.
Amen. Josh, I see the wheels turning.
Oh man, like what can I even add to that?
So here's what I want us to do for our final few minutes, because I want to leave us somewhere in a healthy space. And I think this dialogue, this conversation of what Jennings presents is profound. Honest, this might be my new favorite book because the way he talks about theology is kind of where I live in. So I'm very grateful for this text. But using your theological imagination, how do you envision an incarnational Christianity that prioritizes transformation and intimacy? These are two things that he talks a lot about, that transformation and intimacy, this communal discernment, this communal imagination that we've disconnected from. And as Osharye talked about in the beginning, that the individual is not the supreme one for Jennings. There's this collective identity that we then share and that we get close to one another, that we share with one another, we share in with each other. How do we go about doing that? What does that mean? And how do you see theological imagination playing a part in that?
Yeah, Josh, I wrote down 3 words when you tossed us this question just a little while ago: posture, privilege, and perseverance. And posture comes to mind, is even in my own prayer life. A lot of times my heart follows where my posture takes it. So postures of humility, postures of following, Philippians 2, following the path of Jesus, that reminding myself that I am here to die to myself so that the glory of God can be displayed throughout the world. Privilege, I push a lot of our people right now in my context. I think it takes a lot more energy to try to deny that privilege exists than just trying to own the privilege that you have and surrender it to the gospel for the good of the world. And to me, that's a major shift for a lot of folks. And I don't think I have time to unpack that right now, but then just perseverance, that we have made strides in our country, but we have so much more work to do, and it's not going to be done overnight. So we have to wake up every day just centering our hearts in the kingdom of God and what it is God is doing, and how God, I think, still believes that the church is a force in the world for what we are talking about today.
Yes. Tiffany, Osharye, any last comments? Well, honestly, I want to thank you all for choosing to read this text. I'm sure most of you are like me. When Dr. Taylor asks, you say yes. I genuinely, Dr. Taylor knows this, but honestly, there are very few people in my life who I hold in such high regard and such high esteem. And I appreciate always the opportunity to help, but even more so, I am so deeply thankful for the wisdom and guidance that God has poured into you and the way that you draw people together to have these difficult conversations, these important dialogues, but more so for us to think about how to be better in terms of what we claim to believe in the one who we believe in. So with that, I will turn it back over to our moderator, to Byron, one of my good friends.
Thank you so much, Josh, and the panel, Osharye, Tiffany, Josh, Ross. Thank you all so much. Most people don't know this. Josh Ross and I went to the same high school. Not at the same time, though. I just, even though he doesn't look it, I'm the younger one. I came around later. But thank y'all so much for really centering us in this topic? How do we reimagine how we're going to think through this situation, and how is that going to be guided, and how are we going into the soul work to make that possible?